The faded photograph sits in my hands, impossibly ancient, impossibly clear. It shouldn't exist, not really. Photography as we understand it wasn't invented until decades after the date inscribed on its reverse, January 20th, 1810. Yet here it is, amber-toned, remarkably preserved, and undeniably authentic according to every test I've subjected it to. I found it buried in the archives of the Blackwood Historical Society, tucked inside a weathered leather journal, whose pages were filled with a spidery, urgent handwriting that spoke of impossible things. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical funeral scene from the early 19th century. Somber faces gathered around a wooden casket, a priest with his prayer book open, the flicker of candles casting long shadows across a small church interior. But then I saw it. The figure standing behind the priest, partially obscured in shadow, yet unmistakably the same man whose portrait adorned the closed casket laid out before the congregation. This is the story of how a small Massachusetts town called Ravenwood was forever changed by what came to be known as the Hargrove Incident of 1810, a story of boundaries crossed, of ancient hungers, and of things that refused to remain dead. My name is Jonathan Pierce, and I've spent 20 years researching historical anomalies, events and artifacts that defy conventional explanation. I've investigated supposed hauntings in colonial-era mansions, examined alleged witch bottles found beneath old New England hearths, and cataloged dozens of inexplicable photographs throughout American history. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered about Ezekiel Hargrove and the events surrounding his funeral in that snowbound winter over 2 centuries ago. The winter of 1810 was particularly harsh in Ravenwood and throughout Massachusetts. Historical weather records from that year describe it as a season of exceptional severity, with snows beginning in early November and scarcely abating until April. Snow piled high against windowsills and the wind howled through bare trees like a banshee's wail. Rivers froze solid enough for horse-drawn wagons to cross. The townspeople huddled in their homes, burning what little firewood they had managed to collect before the first blizzard struck. Food was scarce and spirits were low. Wild game had retreated deep into the forests, and what stored provisions existed were carefully rationed. Deaths from cold and hunger were not uncommon that winter throughout New England. But for the Hargrove family, things were about to get much worse. Ezekiel Hargrove was not a well-liked man, though he was certainly respected. As the town's only undertaker, he had grown cold and distant over his 30 years of service. Some said it was the constant company of the dead that had stolen whatever warmth he once possessed. Others whispered that he had never been quite right, even as a child. There were stories about young Ezekiel, how he would collect dead animals he found in the woods, not to bury them as a compassionate child might, but to study their decomposition with clinical detachment. How, at age 12, he apprenticed himself to his father, Abraham Hargrove, the previous undertaker, showing an unnerving enthusiasm for the family business that disturbed even the pragmatic elder Hargrove. His wife Margaret had passed 5 years prior to the events I'm about to relate, leaving him alone in the large house at the edge of town, where he both lived and conducted his business. They'd had no children, another detail that raised eyebrows among the superstitious townsfolk, who whispered that Margaret's womb had been cursed by her husband's congress with the dead. More likely, as Dr. Montgomery's records suggest, Margaret suffered from a medical condition that prevented conception, but the rumors persisted nonetheless. The Hargrove residence was a peculiar structure, originally built in 1725 by Jeremiah Hargrove, Ezekiel's great-grandfather, and the first of the family to practice the undertaker's trade in Ravenwood. The house stood 2 stories tall, constructed of dark timber and local stone, with oddly placed windows that seemed to peer out at the town like suspicious eyes. Behind the main structure was a separate wing where the business of death was conducted, bodies prepared, coffins built, and grieving families received. The house sat at the edge of town, bordered on one side by the beginnings of the vast forest that stretched beyond Ravenwood, and on the other by the town cemetery, a convenient arrangement for a man of Ezekiel's profession. On January 15, 1810, Ezekiel failed to appear at the widow Sullivan's home to collect her husband's body for preparation. Michael Sullivan had succumbed to pneumonia after a week's illness, not an uncommon fate that winter. The widow had sent word to Ezekiel the previous evening and expected him at first light, as was his invariable custom. When noon came with no sign of the undertaker, concern began to grow. This was unprecedented. Regardless of weather or personal circumstance, Ezekiel Hargrove had never once neglected his duties. Even during the blizzard of 1807, he had somehow made his way through 4-foot snowdrifts to retrieve the body of Judge William Harrison, returning to his workshop with his customary grim efficiency despite the elements. Concerned, though not overly so, Mayor Edmund Clark dispatched young Thomas Blackwood, the town constable, to check on the undertaker. Thomas, only 26 years old but already respected for his level-headedness, bundled himself against the bitter cold and made his way to the Hargrove house, following the narrow path that had been kept somewhat clear between the town center and the cemetery. What Thomas discovered at the Hargrove residence would become the first thread in a tapestry of horror that would unfold over the coming weeks. The front door of the house stood slightly ajar, allowing snow to drift into the entryway. This in itself was alarming. Ezekiel was known for his fastidiousness, and leaving a door open during a Massachusetts winter would have been completely out of character. Thomas called out Ezekiel's name but received no response. As he moved deeper into the house, a strange odor assaulted his nostrils. Not the familiar scent of death and chemicals that typically permeated the undertaker's home, but something different, something wrong. In his written account, later recovered from the town records and included in the journal I discovered, Thomas described it as a scent like the bottom of a pond, dredged up and left to bake in summer sun. Not putrescence as one might associate with natural death, but something more primordial, as if the very air had somehow soured and curdled. Thomas moved cautiously through the main living areas, the parlor with its austere furnishings, the kitchen with a cold hearth and food laid out for a breakfast never consumed, the study with its meticulous records of every death in Ravenwood for the past 3 decades. Everything was in order, yet the sense of wrongness intensified as he progressed toward the rear of the house, where Ezekiel conducted his business. In his written account, Thomas described entering Ezekiel's workshop at the back of the house. The room was in perfect order, tools laid out meticulously on a workbench of polished oak, chemicals properly stored in labeled glass bottles on shelves along one wall, the preparation table clean and empty, its marble surface gleaming in the winter light that filtered through the high windows. But Ezekiel was nowhere to be found. Thomas searched the entire house before finally checking the cellar, a place he had never had occasion to enter before. The heavy oak door that led below was not just unlocked but standing open, another detail entirely at odds with Ezekiel's character. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended into darkness, a single lantern held aloft to guide his way. The cellar was unexpectedly vast, stretching beyond what should have been possible given the dimensions of the house above. And it was cold, colder even than the winter air outside. Thomas's breath frosted in front of him as he called out once more for Ezekiel, his voice echoing strangely among the stone walls, as if the sound were being swallowed rather than reflected. Wooden shelves lined the walls, holding more chemicals, rolls of linen for wrapping bodies, and various tools of the undertaker's trade. Barrels of preserving fluid stood in neat rows. Everything was organized with Ezekiel's trademark precision. Yet something about the cellar's dimensions continued to trouble Thomas. According to his account, he'd taken nearly 30 paces from the foot of the stairs to the far wall, a distance that would have put him well beyond the physical boundaries of the house as viewed from outside. In the farthest corner of the cellar, Thomas discovered a door, small, almost like a cupboard, but made of metal rather than wood. It was secured with a heavy padlock, which, to Thomas's surprise, hung open. The door itself was etched with strange symbols, not letters from any alphabet Thomas recognized, but intricate patterns that seemed to shift and change if looked at too directly. Drawing a deep breath to steady his nerves, the constable pulled the door open. The hinges moved silently, as if recently oiled, revealing absolute darkness beyond. Thomas raised his lantern, but the light seemed to penetrate only a few inches before being devoured by the blackness. What he found inside defied explanation. A narrow passage extended beyond the door, roughly hewn from the earth and lined with strange symbols Thomas had never seen before. The same symbols that adorned the door, but more numerous and complex. The walls themselves seemed to pulse slightly, as if breathing. The air that wafted from the tunnel was even colder than the cellar, carrying that same pond-bottom stench, but stronger now, almost overwhelming. Against his better judgment, driven by duty and growing concern, he entered the passage. The tunnel floor sloped downward at a gentle angle, taking him deeper beneath the earth. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly with a bluish phosphorescence as he moved farther from the cellar, providing just enough light that Thomas extinguished his lantern to conserve oil. 20 feet in, the tunnel opened into a small chamber, and there, sitting at a desk as if engaged in business correspondence, was Ezekiel Hargrove. Only he wasn't alive, nor was he recently deceased. According to Thomas's account, Ezekiel appeared to have been dead for weeks, his body desiccated and partially mummified. Yet there was no smell of decay, and his clothes, a fine suit Thomas had never seen him wear, made of a fabric that seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence, were immaculate. Ezekiel sat upright in an ornately carved chair that Thomas described as fashioned from what appeared to be human bones, yellowed with age but unmistakable in their origin. The desk before him was constructed of a black material that resembled polished obsidian, but felt, when Thomas later touched it, warm and yielding, like flesh. Most disturbing of all was the expression on Ezekiel's face. He was smiling, not the slight professional smile he might offer to grieving families, but a wide, almost ecstatic grin that stretched his desiccated features in a manner that should have been physically impossible. On the desk before him lay a single sheet of paper with just 3 words written in an elegant hand: "I am returning." Thomas fled the cellar and immediately reported his findings to Mayor Edmund Clark. Within hours, a group of town elders had gathered at the Hargrove house to verify the constable's incredible story. The group included Dr. James Montgomery, the town physician, Reverend Samuel Wilson, minister of the local Congregational Church, Benjamin Fletcher, the blacksmith, and William Thatcher, a wealthy merchant who served on the town council. The men, carrying lanterns and armed with pistols and a musket, descended to the cellar, with Thomas leading the way. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, they found no metal door, no tunnel, and no Ezekiel. The cellar appeared much smaller than Thomas had described, extending only as far as the natural dimensions of the house would allow. It contained a few barrels of preserved food and bottles of embalming fluid, but no shelves of supplies, no strange symbols, and certainly no hidden passage. Believing Thomas to be either mistaken or lying, the men were about to leave when someone, Dr. Montgomery, according to most accounts, noticed a puddle of strange liquid in the center of the dirt floor. It was black as pitch and seemed to move slightly, even in the still air of the cellar. When the doctor knelt to examine it more closely, the others reported that the liquid appeared to recoil from his approach, contracting into itself like a living thing. Mayor Clark ordered everyone to leave immediately and had the house sealed until further investigation could be conducted. He placed the key in his waistcoat pocket and stationed 2 men, armed with muskets, at the perimeter of the property, with instructions to allow no one to enter. That night, a fire broke out in the Hargrove house. Despite the snow and the best efforts of the townspeople, who formed a bucket brigade from the nearby well, the building was completely destroyed. The flames that consumed it were described by multiple witnesses as burning with an unusual color, not the orange-red of normal fire, but a deep blue-green that cast eerie shadows across the snow. The heat was intense enough to melt the ice on trees nearly 50 feet away, yet strangely, no smoke rose from the conflagration. By morning, nothing remained but a blackened foundation filled with ash and twisted metal, the remnants of tools and furniture. As dawn broke over the smoldering ruins, something caught the eye of Thomas Blackwood, who had remained at the scene throughout the night. Among the ashes and charred timbers lay a body, badly burned, but recognizable by its size and the remnants of clothing as Ezekiel Hargrove. The corpse was curled in a fetal position, arms wrapped around itself as if in protection or extreme pain. Dr. Montgomery, summoned to examine the remains, confirmed the identity based on a distinctive ring still on one charred finger, a silver piece set with a black stone that Ezekiel had always worn. The doctor noted, however, that the body showed signs of having been dead well before the fire began. The manner in which the limbs have contracted indicates post-mortem exposure to heat rather than the defensive postures typically assumed by those who perish in fires, he wrote in his subsequent report. The official account, as recorded in the town ledger, stated that Ezekiel had died in the fire, likely having returned home and somehow started the blaze accidentally. The strange events in the cellar were attributed to Thomas's overwrought imagination and the poor light of his single lantern. The town prepared to bury their undertaker and move on, but this is where the story should have ended. Instead, it was merely the prologue to a mystery that would span generations. Ezekiel's funeral was scheduled for January 20th, 5 days after the discovery of his body. In the absence of another undertaker, the town physician, Dr. James Montgomery, prepared the remains as best he could. Given the condition of the body, it was decided that the casket would remain closed during the service, with a portrait of Ezekiel displayed atop it, a common practice for the time, especially when a body was too damaged for viewing. The portrait itself was the subject of some discussion among the town elders. The only known painting of Ezekiel had hung in the town hall, a somber depiction commissioned 10 years earlier showing the undertaker in his professional attire, expression stern and forbidding. But the fire had been so intense that it had reduced almost all of Ezekiel's possessions to ash, including any personal portraits that might have been more suitable. In the end, they used what they had. The town hall portrait was carefully removed from its frame and placed in a smaller one that could rest atop the casket. Mayor Clark, who had known Ezekiel since childhood, remarked that it was perhaps fitting that he should be remembered as he lived, in service to his profession rather than in any moments of personal warmth, which were, in truth, exceedingly rare. The service was held in St. George's Church, the only house of worship in Ravenwood. Despite the general dislike for Ezekiel, nearly the entire town attended, partly out of respect for the office he had held, partly out of curiosity about the strange circumstances of his death, and partly because in such a small community, funerals were social events regardless of the deceased. St. George's was a modest structure built in 1760 of local stone and timber, with a single nave and a small bell tower. Its interior was austere in the New England tradition. Plain wooden pews, unadorned white walls, and clear glass windows that offered little protection against the winter cold. The only concessions to ornament were the carved wooden altar and a simple cross hung on the wall behind it. On the day of the funeral, snow fell steadily from a leaden sky. The townspeople arrived wrapped in their warmest clothes, breaths visible in the frigid air of the unheated church. The closed casket, constructed of pine and stained a deep brown, rested before the altar. Atop it sat Ezekiel's portrait in its new frame, alongside a spray of evergreen boughs, the only plants available in the depths of winter. Father Michael Collins, the elderly priest who had served the parish for over 40 years, presided over the service. He was a tall, thin man with a shock of white hair and rheumy eyes that had seen generations of Ravenwood residents pass from cradle to grave. Though not particularly fond of Ezekiel, Father Collins was known for finding appropriate words for even the most difficult funerals. The service began with a hymn, followed by a reading from the Book of Job. Father Collins then delivered a brief eulogy that managed to acknowledge Ezekiel's dedication to his profession without straying into insincere praise of his character. As he spoke the words of committal, something unusual caught the attention of those seated in the first few rows. A figure seemed to be standing in the shadows behind the altar, partially concealed by the heavy velvet curtains that separated the sanctuary from the vestry. At first, no one thought much of it, perhaps an altar boy or the church caretaker. But as Father Collins raised his hands in blessing over the casket, the figure moved slightly, and several gasps rose from the congregation. The face that peered out from behind the curtain was unmistakably that of Ezekiel Hargrove, not the stern, formal visage from the portrait atop the casket, but Ezekiel as few had ever seen him, smiling that same impossible wide grin that Thomas had described seeing on his desiccated corpse in the underground chamber. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his eyes reflected the candlelight in a way that reminded some witnesses of a cat's eyes glowing in darkness. In the chaos that followed, several people fled the church, while others moved toward the altar to investigate. Father Collins, unaware of what had caused the disturbance, continued with the service until Thomas Blackwood rushed past him and tore open the curtain. There was no one there. The vestry beyond was empty save for the usual religious accoutrements, robes hanging on pegs, liturgical books on shelves, a small table where communion bread and wine were prepared. The only exit was a door that led outside, but it was locked from within, and undisturbed snow piled against it on the exterior side. A thorough search of the church revealed no sign of Ezekiel or anyone who might have been mistaken for him. The casket remained closed and undisturbed. Eventually, once order was restored, the service continued, and Ezekiel Hargrove was buried in the town cemetery, his grave marked with a simple stone. The incident might have been dismissed as mass hysteria or a trick of the light, except for one crucial detail. Present at the funeral was Harold Jenkins, a traveling daguerreotypist who had arrived in Ravenwood the previous day. Jenkins was an anomaly in several respects. The daguerreotype process wouldn't be announced to the world until 1839, nearly 3 decades after the events in Ravenwood. Yet Jenkins claimed to possess knowledge of a similar technique, derived, he said, from his studies with an Arab alchemist during his travels in Egypt. Despite the fact that the photographic process as we know it today was not yet invented in 1810, Jenkins claimed to possess a unique apparatus of his own design that could capture images using principles similar to the camera obscura, combined with light-sensitive chemicals he had discovered during his travels in the Orient. He was a tall, gaunt man with a neatly trimmed beard and intense eyes that several townspeople described as unnervingly penetrating. His clothing was of high quality but showed the wear of extensive travel, and he spoke with an accent that suggested education in England, though he claimed American birth. Around his neck hung a silver amulet of unusual design, a spiral pattern that bore some resemblance to the symbols Thomas had reported seeing in the hidden chamber beneath Ezekiel's house. Jenkins had arrived in Ravenwood ostensibly to document architectural features of early American settlements for a book he claimed to be writing. He had approached Mayor Clark shortly after his arrival, requesting permission to create images of the town's most significant buildings. But his questions, some remembered later, had focused particularly on the Hargrove family and their long history in Ravenwood. Few in Ravenwood believed Jenkins' claims about his invention, but he had offered to capture the moment of committal, as he put it, free of charge, as a demonstration of his skills and to commemorate the unusual circumstance of an undertaker's funeral. Mayor Clark had agreed, seeing no harm in humoring the eccentric traveler. Jenkins set up his strange device, a large wooden box on a tripod, draped with black cloth, at the back of the church before the service began. The apparatus drew curious looks from the congregation, many of whom had never seen anything like it. A lens protruded from the front of the box, aimed toward the altar. Jenkins himself remained beneath the cloth for much of the service, making adjustments to his equipment. At the moment Father Collins began the final blessing, Jenkins exposed whatever photosensitive material was inside his contraption, later retreating to the room he had rented at the local inn to develop the image through a process he refused to explain to the curious townsfolk, claiming it involved trade secrets of considerable value. The next morning, Jenkins appeared at the mayor's office, pale and trembling, the photograph clutched in his hands. What he had captured defied explanation and would change the course of Ravenwood's history forever. The photograph, the very same one I now hold in my hands, clearly shows Father Collins standing before Ezekiel's closed casket, his hands raised in blessing. The congregation is visible in profile, their faces solemn, and standing directly behind Father Collins, partially shrouded in shadow but unmistakably present, is Ezekiel Hargrove, the same Ezekiel whose burned body lay in the closed casket before the priest. In the photograph, Ezekiel's expression is different from what witnesses described seeing in the church. Rather than the maniacal grin, his face bears a look of intense concentration, as if he is focusing on some difficult task. One hand is slightly raised, fingers splayed in what might be a gesture of blessing or of grasping. Most disturbing is the quality of his appearance in the image. While Father Collins and the congregation appear solid and substantial, Ezekiel has a translucent quality, as if he were not fully present in the physical world. Through parts of his form, the wall behind him is faintly visible. According to the journal I discovered alongside the photograph, Jenkins was so disturbed by what he had captured that he fled Ravenwood that same day, leaving the photograph with Mayor Clark. He included a frantic note stating that while developing the image, he had heard scratching sounds coming from inside the walls of his room and felt a cold presence watching him work. He claimed that when the image began to appear in his developing solution, the liquid had momentarily turned black and given off the same foul odor that Thomas had reported smelling in Ezekiel's cellar. Most significantly, Jenkins wrote that he had come to Ravenwood specifically in search of such phenomena. "It is as I feared," his note read. "The breach has begun. I had hoped to prevent it, but I have arrived too late. Now I can only try to contain what has been set in motion." Mayor Clark immediately ordered Ezekiel's grave to be exhumed. A small group of men, including Thomas Blackwood and Dr. Montgomery, proceeded to the cemetery as dusk fell. The grave was located near the eastern wall, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak tree that had stood in the cemetery since before the town's founding. The men worked in silence, the sound of shovels cutting through the frozen earth, the only noise in the gathering darkness. What they found, or rather what they didn't find, only deepened the mystery. The casket was exactly where they had buried it, undisturbed. The earth above it showed no signs of having been tampered with. But when they opened it, it was empty. Not a trace remained of Ezekiel's charred body. The interior of the pine box was pristine, the lining unrumpled, as if it had never contained a corpse at all. Dr. Montgomery examined the casket carefully, looking for any sign that it might not be the same one they had buried. He found none. It was unmistakably the casket he himself had helped prepare, down to a distinctive knot in the wood on the right side panel. "It is as if the body has simply dissolved," he wrote in his report. "Yet there is no residue, no trace. It has not been removed, it has vanished." Panic swept through Ravenwood. Doors were locked, windows shuttered, and no one ventured out after dark. The mayor established a curfew and organized search parties to comb the surrounding woods for any sign of Ezekiel or his body, but nothing was found. Some families spoke of leaving town until the matter was resolved, but the continuing severe weather made travel almost impossible. They were trapped in Ravenwood with whatever Ezekiel had become. The town council met daily to discuss the situation, but with no precedent for such occurrences, they found themselves at a loss. Some advocated a rational approach, suggesting that someone had stolen the body for unknown purposes, perhaps as a macabre prank or for some arcane medical study. Others, including Reverend Wilson, argued that they were dealing with something supernatural that required spiritual intervention. He proposed an exorcism of both the empty grave and the church where Ezekiel's apparition had been seen. Dr. Montgomery, a man of science, suggested that the strange events might be the result of a collective delusion brought on by the stress of the harsh winter and the unusual circumstances of Ezekiel's death. The human mind, when subjected to extreme conditions, is capable of manufacturing experiences that have no basis in physical reality, he told the council. Perhaps what we are experiencing is a form of shared hysteria. 3 days after the funeral, the first disappearance occurred. Sarah Williams, a 16-year-old girl who worked as a maid for the Montgomery family, failed to return home from an errand. She had been sent to deliver a package to the home of Widow Sullivan and should have been gone no more than half an hour. When she hadn't returned after 2 hours, her mother grew concerned and went to the Sullivan house, only to learn that Sarah had never arrived. A search was immediately organized. Men with lanterns spread out through the town, calling Sarah's name, checking outbuildings and alleyways. They found her footprints in the snow, following the expected route toward Widow Sullivan's house, but the tracks ended abruptly in the middle of the main street, as if she had been plucked from the ground. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication that she had deviated from her path. She had simply vanished. Sarah's disappearance transformed the town's unease into outright fear. Parents refused to let their children out of sight. People traveled in groups even during daylight hours. The nightly curfew was moved earlier, and armed men patrolled the streets. A week later, George Peterson, the town blacksmith, vanished from his forge in the middle of the day. A customer had left him working on a set of horseshoes and returned 30 minutes later to find the forge fire still burning, the metal still hot on the anvil, but no sign of Peterson. The only evidence that something unusual had occurred was a small puddle of black liquid on the dirt floor, the same substance Thomas had reported seeing in Ezekiel's cellar. Over the next month, 5 more townspeople disappeared without a trace. Each vanishing followed the same pattern: a brief absence from observation, no signs of struggle, and often a small quantity of the mysterious black liquid found nearby. Fear gripped Ravenwood like a physical presence, choking the life and spirit from the community. Some families packed their belongings and left, preferring to face the harsh winter journey than remain in a town that seemed cursed. Throughout this period, there were multiple sightings of Ezekiel Hargrove. He was seen standing at the edge of the forest at dusk, his tall figure unmistakable against the snow-covered trees. He was glimpsed through windows, staring into homes where he had no business being. He was spotted in the cemetery, standing motionless beside his own empty grave. But whenever anyone approached or called out to him, he would vanish, leaving nothing behind but a faint smell of embalming chemicals and sometimes a small puddle of the black liquid. Those who saw him at close range reported that he appeared solid enough, yet somehow wrong. His movements were described as too fluid, as if his joints bent in ways a human should not. His eyes reflected light like an animal's, and his skin had a grayish cast. Most disturbing was his expression, always that same wide, unnatural smile that seemed to stretch beyond the capabilities of human facial muscles. On February 25th, exactly 1 month after Ezekiel's funeral, Father Collins requested a meeting with Mayor Clark and the remaining town elders. The elderly priest had been researching in the church archives and had made a disturbing discovery. St. George's Church maintained records dating back to the founding of Ravenwood in 1725. Among these were the personal journals of previous parish priests, including Father Anthony Morris, who had served from 1740 to 1760. In his journal for the year 1750, Father Morris had recorded a series of events that bore an uncanny resemblance to what was currently happening in Ravenwood. According to parish records, there had been another Hargrove, Jeremiah, Ezekiel's great-grandfather, who had also served as the town's undertaker. Jeremiah had died under mysterious circumstances in 1750. His body found in the woods with no visible injuries, yet unmistakably dead. In the month following his death, 7 people had disappeared. The records mentioned a daguerreotype showing Jeremiah standing behind the priest at his own funeral, despite his body being present in the casket. This, of course, should have been impossible. The photographic process wouldn't be invented for another century. Yet there it was, written in the spidery handwriting of Father Collins's predecessor. Father Morris had described the image as a rendering most unnatural, showing the departed standing among the living, his countenance marked by a terrible knowledge. Even more disturbing was the fact that the disappearances had apparently ended when the townspeople exhumed Jeremiah's body, which, unlike Ezekiel's, was still in its casket, burned it to ashes, and scattered them in running water while reciting specific prayers that Father Morris had discovered in a book he described only as the Black Volume. Father Collins had searched for this book among the church archives but found no trace of it. He suggested they do the same with Ezekiel's body, if they could find it. The elderly priest, his hands trembling as he turned the pages of his predecessor's journal, read aloud the final entry regarding the Jeremiah Hargrove incident. "May God forgive us for what we have done this day, though I believe it necessary. The thing we burned wore Jeremiah's face but was not him. As the flames consumed it, the countenance it wore melted away like wax before a fire, revealing briefly something beneath that I will not describe, lest the memory drive me to madness. I know only that it was ancient beyond reckoning and hungry beyond satiation. The Hargroves have trafficked with forces they cannot control, and I fear this will not be the last time Ravenwood faces such a visitation. May those who come after us have the wisdom and courage to recognize the signs and act accordingly." That night, as the town elders debated the priest's recommendation, Thomas Blackwood was on patrol near the cemetery when he noticed a figure standing beside Ezekiel's empty grave. Convinced it was the undertaker's ghost, or whatever unnatural thing he had become, Thomas approached cautiously, his pistol drawn. The cemetery was silent, save for the crunch of snow beneath Thomas's boots. A quarter moon provided just enough light to navigate between the headstones, their shadows stretching like accusing fingers across the white ground. The figure stood motionless, its back to Thomas, seemingly absorbed in contemplation of the empty grave. As he drew closer, the figure turned. It was not Ezekiel, but Harold Jenkins, the traveling daguerreotypist who had supposedly fled Ravenwood weeks earlier. He was thinner than Thomas remembered, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. He wore the same clothes he had on the day of the funeral, now travel-stained and torn in places. The silver amulet still hung around his neck, seeming to gleam with its own light in the darkness. "Constable Blackwood," Jenkins said, his voice hoarse, "I've been hoping to find you." Before Thomas could question him, Jenkins spoke. "He's coming back through. We must seal the passage." Thomas, pistol still raised, demanded an explanation. Jenkins glanced nervously at the surrounding darkness, then leaned closer. "Not here," he whispered. "We're being watched. Follow me, but at a distance. Make it appear that you're simply continuing your patrol." Jenkins then led a confused and wary Thomas to a small cave in the hillside beyond the cemetery, a place the constable had passed many times but never thought to explore. The entrance was narrow, barely large enough for a man to squeeze through, but it opened into a larger chamber that bore signs of recent habitation: a bedroll, some food supplies, and various scientific instruments Thomas didn't recognize. A small fire burned in a carefully constructed stone pit, its smoke drawn upward through a natural chimney in the cave ceiling. The walls were covered in the same strange symbols Thomas had seen in Ezekiel's cellar, though these appeared to have been freshly drawn with charcoal. Several books lay open on a makeshift table fashioned from a flat stone, their pages covered in diagrams and text in languages Thomas couldn't identify. "You've been here all along," Thomas said, finally lowering his pistol. "Everyone thought you'd fled town." Jenkins moved about the cave, lighting additional lanterns. "I considered it," he admitted, "after what I saw in that photograph, but I couldn't leave, not knowing what was happening. Not when I might be the only one who understands what we're facing." He explained that he had never actually left Ravenwood. After developing the photograph and seeing Ezekiel standing behind the priest, he had realized what was happening and had been working to stop it ever since. According to Jenkins, he had encountered similar phenomena in his travels, instances where the dead refused to stay dead, where they found ways to return to the world of the living through what he called thin places. "Thin places?" Thomas asked, examining one of the open books without touching it. The diagrams depicted what appeared to be doorways or arches, with human figures passing through them into landscapes that looked distinctly alien. Skies with multiple suns, vegetation unlike anything on Earth. "That's what the Celtic peoples called them," Jenkins said. "Locations where the boundary between our world and others is not as robust as it should be. The veil between life and death, between here and elsewhere, grows permeable in such places." The cave, Jenkins believed, was one such place. A point where the barrier between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond was weakened. He had traced a series of disappearances across New England over the past 60 years, all following a pattern: an undertaker's death, a funeral disruption, an impossible image, and then people vanishing, only to be replaced by subtly changed versions of themselves months or years later. "Replaced?" Thomas asked. "What do you mean?" Jenkins's expression grew grave. "The missing don't stay missing, Constable. They come back, or rather something wearing their faces comes back. In other towns, other cities, I've tracked the pattern. The disappearances last a month, perhaps 2. Then the missing persons return, full of plausible explanations for their absences. But they're not the same." "How so?" "Little things at first. Preferences changed, memories slightly altered, skills they didn't possess before. But over time, the differences become more pronounced. They avoid sunlight. They don't eat in public. They speak of strange concepts in unguarded moments, and they help others disappear." Jenkins claimed to be part of a secret society dedicated to monitoring these breaches and sealing them when possible. He had come to Ravenwood tracking the pattern, suspecting that as the descendant of Jeremiah, Ezekiel might be the next to create such a breach. Unfortunately, he had arrived too late to prevent Ezekiel's death, or rather, his transformation. "The Hargrove family has a long and dark history," Jenkins explained, showing Thomas a genealogical chart he had constructed. "They've served as undertakers in various New England towns for over a century, and wherever they practice their trade, these phenomena eventually occur. It's not coincidence. They're selected, groomed for the role." "By whom?" Thomas asked. "Or what?" Jenkins hesitated. "We call them the outsiders. Entities that exist beyond our reality, but seek entry to it. They cannot simply force their way in. Our universe has, let's call them antibodies, that resist direct incursion. But they can find weak points, thin places, and work through human agents to widen the gaps." According to Jenkins's theory, Ezekiel wasn't truly dead. He had undergone a metamorphosis, becoming a kind of doorway between worlds. The empty casket, the appearances around town, the disappearances, all were symptoms of a widening breach. "Ezekiel spent his life in proximity to death," Jenkins continued. "That constant exposure weakened the natural barriers we all possess against the outsider's influence. The mysterious chamber you found beneath his house? I believe he had been conducting rituals there for years, preparing himself to serve as a conduit. The fire that destroyed his home was likely his final transformation, a chrysalis stage, if you will." Thomas, educated but practical, struggled to believe Jenkins' fantastic claims, but he had seen enough strange occurrences over the past month to at least consider the possibility that something beyond his understanding was happening in Ravenwood. "You're asking me to believe in what? Ghosts? Demons?" Jenkins shook his head. "Nothing so familiar or comfortable. The entities we're dealing with have no place in human religion or folklore. They are utterly alien to our reality, operating according to principles we can barely comprehend. That's what makes them so dangerous. We have no cultural framework to understand or combat them. Jenkins showed Thomas his research, pages of notes, diagrams of celestial alignments, and most disturbing of all, sketches of creatures that seemed neither human nor animal but some nightmarish combination of both. These entities, Jenkins claimed, were what waited on the other side of the breach, wearing the faces of those they had taken, learning to pass as human. One drawing in particular caught Thomas's attention, a figure with a human-like body but too many joints, its head a mass of writhing tentacles surrounding a vertical slit that might have been a mouth. "What is this?" he asked. "That," Jenkins said grimly, "is what I glimpsed beneath Jeremiah Hargrove's face when I encountered him in Boston in 1765, 15 years after the Ravenwood incident. He was using a different name, working as an undertaker in a different town, but I recognized him. When confronted, he changed." "You're that old?" Thomas asked, disbelief evident in his voice. Jenkins smiled thinly. "My society has methods of prolonging life in those who serve our cause. We fight a very long war, Constable Blackwood, one that spans centuries. Ezekiel is their herald," Jenkins explained. "He prepared the way, and now he's helping them cross over. Each disappearance weakens the barrier further. The black liquid you've seen? That's not of our world. It's their essence, seeping through. If we don't stop it soon, the breach will become permanent." Thomas asked the obvious question, how? Jenkins's plan was simultaneously simple and incredibly dangerous. They needed to find Ezekiel's true body, not the burned corpse that had been buried, which Jenkins believed was actually one of Ezekiel's recent embalming subjects, disguised and planted to fool the town. The real Ezekiel, or what remained of him, would be near the center of the breach. "The being you saw in the underground chamber," Jenkins said, "was Ezekiel in transition. His physical form was being altered to serve as a living doorway. That form still exists somewhere, anchoring the breach to our reality. We need to destroy it using fire, silver, and salt, while reciting an incantation I've reconstructed from various sources." He showed Thomas a page covered in text, written in an alphabet the constable had never seen before. "This is the language of the outsiders," Jenkins explained. "Learning it is dangerous. The very shapes of the letters can alter human consciousness over time. I've spent decades studying it in small doses to avoid being influenced. The incantation must be precise. One mispronunciation could widen the breach instead of closing it. The timing was critical. According to Jenkins's calculations, the breach would be at its weakest during the new moon, when the barrier between worlds was naturally stronger. That gave them 3 days to locate Ezekiel and prepare. "The cave system beneath Ravenwood is extensive," Jenkins said, showing Thomas a rough map he had begun sketching. "Most of it natural, but some sections show signs of deliberate excavation. I believe Ezekiel, or his ancestors, discovered that the entire area sits atop a thin place and have been working for generations to exploit it." Thomas agreed to help, but insisted on bringing Mayor Clark and Dr. Montgomery into their confidence. Jenkins was reluctant, but eventually agreed, recognizing that they would need more than 2 men for what lay ahead. "But not Dr. Montgomery," Jenkins warned. "I've been observing the townsfolk from hiding. The doctor has been behaving oddly since shortly after Ezekiel's funeral. I fear he may have been compromised." "Compromised?" Thomas repeated. "You mean he's one of these replacements?" Jenkins nodded grimly. "It would explain why he's been conducting unusual examinations of children in town, particularly focusing on their throats and eyes. The entities have a special interest in the young. Their bodies are more adaptable, easier to modify." The next day, Thomas brought Mayor Clark to Jenkins's cave. After hearing his explanation and seeing his research, the mayor was skeptical but willing to proceed on the chance that it might end the disappearances plaguing their town. Clark had lost his niece 2 weeks earlier. She had vanished while gathering eggs from the family henhouse and was desperate for any solution, no matter how fantastic it might seem. "I cannot say I believe all of this," the mayor admitted, examining Jenkins's charts and diagrams. "But I have seen enough to know that something unnatural is happening in my town. If there's even a small chance this ritual of yours can end it, I am willing to try." Mayor Clark suggested they also include Father Collins, whose knowledge of church history and ritual might prove valuable. The elderly priest had been increasingly reclusive since sharing his discovery about Jeremiah Hargrove, remaining in the church and refusing visitors. Some said he was praying day and night for divine intervention. Jenkins agreed, but warned that the more people who knew of their plan, the greater the risk that Ezekiel, or whatever he had become, would learn of it and act to stop them. "The entity may look like Ezekiel," Jenkins explained, but it had access to knowledge and powers beyond what any human should possess. These beings communicate with each other across vast distances, he told them. They may appear individual to us, but they share a collective consciousness. If one suspects our intentions, all will know. As night fell, the three men made their way to the church to speak with Father Collins. They found the church dark and silent, which was unusual. The priest typically kept candles burning through the night as a symbol of divine presence. Thomas called out, but there was no response. The men lit lanterns and began to search the building. In the sanctuary, everything appeared normal, but when they reached Father Collins's living quarters at the back of the church, they discovered signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned, papers were scattered across the floor, and most disturbing of all, a large puddle of the black liquid stained the floorboards beneath the priest's desk. Among the scattered papers, Jenkins discovered Father Collins's journal. The final entry, dated that very morning, described how the priest had begun to suspect that something was wrong with Dr. Montgomery. The doctor had visited him the previous evening, asking strange questions about the church's foundations and whether there were any crypts or tunnels beneath the building. Father Collins had become suspicious when he noticed that the doctor never blinked during their entire conversation. Looking more closely, the priest had realized that Montgomery's eyes were not the familiar brown he had known for decades, but solid black, like holes cut into reality itself. "I fear our good doctor is no longer himself," Father Collins had written. "I have sent for Thomas Blackwood, but until he arrives I will barricade myself in my study. May God protect us all from whatever darkness has infected Ravenwood." The three men turned as one to look at the door, alerted by a sound from the church sanctuary. There stood Dr. Montgomery, his figure silhouetted against the faint moonlight coming through the windows. He took a step forward, entering the pool of light cast by their lanterns. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice oddly modulated, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison just slightly out of sync. "I've been looking for Father Collins myself. Have you found him?" "Where is Father Collins?" Mayor Clark demanded, his hand moving to the pistol concealed beneath his coat. Dr. Montgomery smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes that were indeed solid black, without iris or pupil. "I imagine he's with the others by now, or parts of him are at least. The transition can be messy for the elderly. Their bodies resist the necessary changes." What happened next was described differently in each man's subsequent account. Thomas claimed that Dr. Montgomery's face seemed to ripple and shift, like wax melting near a flame. Jenkins wrote that the doctor's eyes turned completely black before he lunged at them with strength no human man should possess. Mayor Clark's report simply stated that Montgomery attacked them in a manner suggesting severe mental disturbance. What all three accounts agree on is that in the struggle that followed, Dr. Montgomery was killed, stabbed through the heart with a letter opener from Father Collins's desk, wielded by Jenkins with surprising precision. The daguerreotypist had targeted a specific point over the heart, driving the silver handle of the letter opener deep into Montgomery's chest while reciting words in that same strange language he had shown Thomas earlier. As the doctor collapsed, his body began to change. His skin turned gray and brittle, crumbling away like ancient parchment. Beneath it was not flesh and bone, but a writhing mass of what Thomas described as black worms or tentacles, each moving with its own purpose, yet part of a greater whole. The mass continued to dissolve until nothing remained but a puddle of the same black liquid they had found earlier. The puddle itself seemed alive, attempting to flow away from them toward the door. Jenkins quickly encircled it with salt from a pouch he carried, trapping it within the boundary. The substance bubbled and steamed when it contacted the salt, giving off the pond-bottom stench Thomas had first encountered in Ezekiel's cellar. "What in God's name was that?" Mayor Clark gasped, his face ashen. "Not Dr. Montgomery," Jenkins replied grimly. "Not for weeks, I suspect. The real doctor likely disappeared shortly after Ezekiel's funeral. This was an outsider wearing his form, gathering information, sabotaging any resistance while the breach widened." He explained, his voice shaking, that the fact they had encountered and destroyed one of these entities meant their plans were now known to whatever waited on the other side of the breach. They would need to act immediately, ready or not. "We have until dawn at most," Jenkins said. "After that, they'll come for us in force. The missing townspeople, or what wears their shapes, will return to stop us, and I fear they'll no longer be concerned with maintaining their human disguises. Jenkins believed that the center of the breach would be in the place where Ezekiel had undergone his transformation, likely the hidden chamber Thomas had originally discovered in the Undertaker's cellar. But that location had been destroyed in the fire. Their best chance now was to search the cave system where Jenkins had been hiding, which he believed connected to other tunnels running beneath the town. The caves follow the path of an underground river that has largely dried up over the centuries, Jenkins explained as they gathered supplies from Father Collins's quarters and the church's storage rooms. The water once ran from the hills, beneath Ravenwood, and out to the coast. The river may be gone, but the passages remain. Armed with lanterns, weapons, and the components Jenkins insisted they would need for the ritual, silver crucifixes, salt, oil, and torches that could be quickly lit, the three men entered the cave as midnight approached. Jenkins led the way, consulting a rough map he had drawn during his explorations. The main tunnel descended steeply before branching into three separate passages. Jenkins indicated the leftmost tunnel, which, according to his map, headed in the direction of the cemetery and the site of Ezekiel's former home. This passage shows signs of recent use, he pointed out. Indeed, the floor of the tunnel bore scuff marks in the dust, as if something had been dragged through it recently. Drops of the black liquid marked the path at irregular intervals, glimmering faintly in the lantern light. As they proceeded, Thomas noticed strange symbols carved into the walls, similar to those he had seen in Ezekiel's hidden cellar room. Jenkins explained that they were wardings, meant to contain whatever lay beyond the breach, but many had been deliberately damaged, their power nullified. These were placed by earlier members of my society, he said, running his fingers over one partially erased symbol. Perhaps after the incident with Jeremiah Hargrove. They would have sealed the thin place temporarily, but someone, Ezekiel most likely, has been systematically destroying them. The air grew colder as they descended deeper into the earth, and an odd humming sound became audible. Not quite music, but rhythmic and somehow intelligible, though none of the men could say what was being communicated. It seemed to come from all directions at once, vibrating through the stone around them rather than traveling through the air. After nearly an hour of careful progress, they emerged into a vast underground chamber that none of them, including Jenkins, had known existed. The ceiling soared at least 30 feet above them, and the chamber itself was roughly circular, perhaps 100 feet in diameter. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, these intact and faintly luminous, casting a greenish glow throughout the space. In the center of the chamber stood a structure that defied easy description. It resembled an archway, but constructed of what appeared to be bones and sinew rather than stone or wood. The bones were clearly human. Skulls formed the keystone and base points, while femurs, ribs, and smaller bones had been woven together to create the arch itself. The sinew connecting them pulsed slightly, as if still living. The space within the arch was not empty, but filled with a swirling darkness that seemed to absorb their lantern light. And before this archway, seated in the same position Thomas had first found him, was Ezekiel Hargrove, or rather, something wearing Ezekiel's face. His eyes were closed, his expression peaceful, as if he were merely sleeping. But his chest did not rise and fall with breath, and his skin had the same gray, brittle appearance they had seen on Dr. Montgomery before his dissolution. Surrounding Ezekiel in a perfect circle were 7 bodies, or parts of bodies, each in a different state of decay. Thomas recognized clothing belonging to some of the missing townspeople. Mayor Clark identified one partial corpse as his niece, her body drastically altered, limbs elongated and twisted into unnatural positions. Another was clearly Father Collins, his clerical collar still visible around what remained of his neck. Jenkins gestured for them to be silent and retreat to the edge of the chamber. Once there, he explained in a whisper that what they were seeing was the breach itself, with Ezekiel as its anchor in the world. The bodies represented sacrifices, their life essence used to widen the gap between worlds. The archway is a physical manifestation of the thin place, he murmured, a doorway between realities. Normally, such transitions would be impossible or extremely difficult for the outsiders, but with enough energy, enough lives, they can create a stable passage. According to Jenkins, the breach was not yet complete. The archway should have been larger, the darkness within it more substantial. They had arrived in time, but barely. They needed to destroy Ezekiel's body and perform the ritual before the process could be completed. The plan was simple, though far from easy. Mayor Clark would create a distraction on the far side of the chamber, while Thomas and Jenkins approached Ezekiel from behind. Jenkins would begin the ritual while Thomas protected him from whatever might emerge from the breach to stop them. "The silver crucifixes will repel the outsiders temporarily," Jenkins instructed. "The salt creates boundaries they cannot easily cross. Use them if anything approaches. And no matter what happens, no matter what you see or hear, do not look directly into the darkness within the arch. The human mind cannot process what exists on the other side." Before they could act, however, Ezekiel's eyes opened. They were entirely black, like pools of the strange liquid that had marked each disappearance. His head turned with fluid grace, far beyond the normal range of human motion, until he was looking directly at their hiding place. "Harold Jenkins," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying the same odd harmonics as the humming they had heard earlier. "We wondered when you would join us. Your kind has interfered in our emergence for too long." Jenkins stepped forward, his fear seemingly replaced by determination. "And we will continue to do so, Hargrove, or whatever you really are. Your breach will be sealed like all the others." Ezekiel smiled, the expression unnaturally wide on his face. "But this breach is different. We have learned from our failures. The Undertaker was the perfect vessel, already comfortable with death, already halfway between worlds. And this place, this town built on land that was sacred to those who knew how to listen to the spaces between stars, it was always meant to be our doorway." As Ezekiel spoke, the bodies surrounding him began to twitch and move, rising jerkily to their feet like macabre puppets. The darkness within the archway pulsed and swirled more rapidly, and Thomas could have sworn he saw shapes moving within it, angular, many-limbed forms that hurt his eyes to look upon. "The human vessels you've taken will decay," Jenkins said, taking another step forward, his hand clutching the silver amulet around his neck. "They cannot sustain your presence in this reality for long. Even Ezekiel's body is failing. Look at yourself, crumbling at the edges." It was true. As Ezekiel stood, flakes of his skin drifted to the ground like ash, revealing glimpses of the writhing blackness beneath. "These bodies are temporary," Ezekiel agreed, his voice now overlapping with others, as if multiple beings spoke through his mouth simultaneously. "But soon we will learn to craft more durable vessels. The knowledge exists in human minds, waiting to be harvested. Anatomy, chemistry, perhaps even your society's secrets of longevity, Jenkins. We have tasted your mind before, in dreams. We will taste it again more directly." "Now!" Jenkins shouted, abandoning the original plan in favor of immediate action. He threw a pouch of salt toward the archway while Mayor Clark fired his pistol at one of the advancing corpses. Thomas rushed toward Ezekiel, a silver crucifix held before him like a shield. The chamber erupted into chaos. The animated corpses moved with unnatural speed, grappling with Mayor Clark as he tried to reload his pistol. The darkness within the archway extended tendrils outward, wrapping around Jenkins as he attempted to recite the incantation from a small book he had produced from inside his coat. Thomas reached Ezekiel and thrust the crucifix toward his face. Ezekiel hissed, the sound more animal than human, and recoiled. His skin began to crack and flake away more rapidly, revealing the same writhing darkness they had seen within Dr. Montgomery. Seeing an opportunity, Thomas tackled Ezekiel, driving him away from the archway. As they struggled on the ground, Thomas pressed the crucifix against Ezekiel's chest while fumbling for the flask of oil Jenkins had given him. If he could douse Ezekiel and set him alight, perhaps it would be enough to disrupt the breach. But Ezekiel was stronger than his desiccated appearance suggested. He grabbed Thomas by the throat, his fingers elongating and tightening like coils of wire. Thomas felt his consciousness fading as Ezekiel leaned close, his breath carrying the scent of open graves. "Your world has forgotten what waits in the dark," Ezekiel whispered, "but we remember you, and we are hungry." A gunshot echoed through the chamber. Ezekiel's head snapped back, a hole appearing in his forehead. Black liquid splattered across the ground behind him. His grip on Thomas loosened. Mayor Clark stood 10 feet away, his pistol still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Somehow he had fought free of the animated corpses, though his clothing was torn and bloody. One arm hung limp at his side, twisted at an impossible angle. "The ritual!" Jenkins shouted, still struggling against the dark tendrils. "Complete the ritual!" Thomas scrambled to his feet, grabbed the oil flask that had fallen during his struggle with Ezekiel, and doused the Undertaker's body. He struck a match and dropped it. Flames engulfed Ezekiel instantly, burning with unusual intensity and a blue-green hue that no natural fire should possess. As Ezekiel burned, Jenkins broke free from the tendrils and rushed to Thomas's side, the ritual components clutched in his hands. Together, they scattered salt around the burning body while Jenkins recited words in a language Thomas didn't recognize. Harsh, guttural sounds interspersed with whistling tones that seemed to hurt the air itself. The archway began to shudder, the bones and sinew cracking and oozing black liquid. The darkness within it roiled violently, and a sound like 1,000 voices screaming in pain and rage filled the chamber. The animated corpses collapsed like marionettes with cut strings. Ezekiel's burning body rose to its feet, still wreathed in supernatural flames. His face had melted away, revealing something beneath that bore no resemblance to human features. A mass of twisting appendages surrounding a vertical slit from which emerged a long, barbed tongue. He lunged toward Jenkins, who continued the incantation without faltering, even as the creature's flaming hands closed around his throat. Thomas grabbed his knife and plunged it into Ezekiel's back, driving the silver blade deep between where shoulder blades would be on a human. The creature released Jenkins and arched backward, a keening wail escaping from whatever passed for its mouth. Jenkins, his voice hoarse but determined, spoke the final words of the ritual and threw a handful of salt directly into the center of the archway. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The archway collapsed in on itself, the bones shattering and disintegrating. The darkness that had filled it imploded with a sound like air rushing to fill a vacuum. A shockwave rippled outward, knocking all three men to the ground. Ezekiel's burning form was drawn toward the collapsing archway, his limbs elongating and twisting as he struggled against the pull. For a moment he seemed suspended between worlds, partly in the chamber with them, partly somewhere else. Then, with a final, inhuman scream, he was sucked into the vanishing darkness, and then silence. The archway was gone. The animated corpses lay still, reverting to ordinary human remains. The strange symbols on the walls had faded to ordinary carvings. The greenish glow was replaced by the warm yellow light of their lanterns. Thomas, Jenkins, and Mayor Clark gathered themselves slowly, checking for injuries. All had sustained cuts and bruises, and Jenkins's throat bore angry red marks where Ezekiel had gripped him, but they were alive. "Is it over?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jenkins nodded wearily. "The breach is sealed. Whatever was trying to come through is trapped on the other side, at least for now. These things, they're patient. They'll try again. Somewhere else. Someone else. But Ravenwood is safe." Mayor Clark, cradling his injured arm, looked at the human remains scattered around the chamber. "These poor souls. My niece, Father Collins. What do we tell their families?" "The truth would only bring more pain," Jenkins advised. "A simplified version. That you found evidence of a disease, Doctor." "Montgomery had been concealing, one that drove its victims to madness before killing them. That he fled town when discovered. But you found the missing in this cave system, already deceased." The three men made their way back through the tunnels to the surface, emerging into the pre-dawn light of a winter morning. The town was quiet, unaware of the battle that had been fought beneath its streets, or how close it had come to an unimaginable fate. In the days that followed, Jenkins documented everything that had occurred, including a detailed account of the ritual used to seal the breach, should it ever be needed again. He gave the journal and the photograph from Ezekiel's funeral to Mayor Clark for safekeeping, along with strict instructions that they should be preserved but kept secret, lest knowledge of the breach attract others who might seek to reopen it. "There are humans who worship the outsiders," Jenkins warned, "who seek their power without understanding their nature. The record must be preserved for those who need it, but hidden from those who would misuse it." The disappearances in Ravenwood ceased. The bodies found in the underground chamber were given proper burials, though the official explanation was that they had been victims of an outbreak of disease hidden by Dr. Montgomery to prevent panic. The doctor himself was said to have fled town after his deception was discovered. Ezekiel Hargrove's grave remained empty, but a new stone was placed above it, inscribed with symbols Jenkins provided, wardings to prevent anything from using it as an anchor point to return. Jenkins left Ravenwood a week later, continuing his mission to track and seal breaches wherever they appeared. Before departing, he took Thomas aside and offered him membership in his secret society. "You've seen the truth now. Jenkins said. "You can never unsee it. You'll notice things others don't. Patterns in disappearances, strange behaviors, impossible photographs. You can choose to ignore them, to convince yourself it was all a delusion brought on by stress and fear. Or you can help us." Thomas asked for time to consider. The constable had been deeply affected by their experience, sleeping poorly and jumping at shadows, but he had also felt a sense of purpose in confronting the breach, in saving his town from an unimaginable fate. In the end, Thomas declined Jenkins's offer. He had responsibilities in Ravenwood, a position, a reputation, a young woman he intended to court, but he promised to keep watch for any signs of the outsider's return and to preserve the records Jenkins had entrusted to Mayor Clark. Jenkins seemed disappointed but understanding. "Not everyone is suited to our life," he said. "It's lonely, dangerous, and offers little reward beyond knowing you've held back the darkness for another day. But remember what you saw, Thomas Blackwood. Remember, and be vigilant." Thomas Blackwood eventually became mayor after Clark retired, using his position to ensure the journal and photograph were preserved as Jenkins had requested. He established the Blackwood Historical Society, specifically to house and protect these and other records of Ravenwood's unusual history, under the guise of ordinary historical preservation. Life in Ravenwood returned to normal, or what passed for normal in a town that had glimpsed what waited beyond the thin places of the world. The incident faded from collective memory, becoming just another local legend, a story told around fires on winter nights. Until now, as I hold the photograph and the journal, I can't help but wonder, how many other breaches has Jenkins's secret society closed over the centuries? How many have they missed? And what happens when one opens fully, with no one there to seal it? The journal's final pages contain a warning that chills me even now. The entities beyond the breach are not demons in the biblical sense, nor are they ghosts or any supernatural beings as we commonly understand them. They are something older, something that existed in the spaces before our reality cohered. They remember when they ruled, and they want to rule again. They wear familiar faces to gain our trust, but they are so fundamentally alien that to truly perceive their nature would shatter a human mind. They cannot create a breach themselves. They need a human anchor, someone who straddles the boundary between life and death. Undertakers are common targets due to their constant proximity to the deceased, but any person who exists in liminal spaces may be vulnerable. Doctors who have lost too many patients, soldiers who have seen too much combat, those who have nearly died themselves only to return, all potential vessels for the outsider's influence. The signs of their presence are consistent across time and location. Unusual cold, especially in enclosed spaces. The black liquid, which is their essence attempting to adapt to our reality. Electronic or mechanical malfunctions. They disrupt electrical fields. Animals behaving erratically in their presence. Most tellingly, the appearance of the recently deceased among the living. Should you find evidence of a new breach forming, disappearances, impossible images, the black liquid that is their essence in our reality, do not investigate alone. Contact the Society immediately through the channels described herein. Time is always against us, and if you ever find yourself at a funeral where the deceased appears among the living, run, and don't look back, because once they can manifest physically enough to be captured in an image, the breach is already widening, and they are coming through. I closed the journal, my hands trembling slightly. The photograph seems to shift in the dim light of my study, the figure behind the priest moving subtly, turning its head toward me. I blink, and it's still again. Just an old photograph from a funeral in 1810, showing a closed casket, a praying priest, and something impossible standing in the shadows behind him. Something that, according to all historical records, shouldn't have been captured on film for at least another 29 years. I should burn them both, the journal and the photograph. That would be the sensible thing to do. But I can't bring myself to destroy what might be the only warning we have. Because last week, in my hometown 300 miles from Ravenwood, a funeral was held for our longtime mortician. And though I didn't attend, I've heard whispers about something strange captured in the background of a mourner's smartphone photo. I need to make some calls. I need to find out if Jenkins's society still exists, because I think another breach is opening, and this time, the things on the other side have had 2 centuries to prepare. The past week has been a blur of research and increasingly disturbing discoveries. After finding the journal and photograph in the Blackwood Historical Society archives, I began searching for any mentions of Harold Jenkins or his secret society in historical records. The results have been sparse but tantalizing. A man matching Jenkins's description appears in records from Boston in 1830, investigating a series of disappearances connected to a hospital morgue. The same man, or one very similar, is mentioned in newspaper accounts from Chicago in 1871, present during the Great Fire, which some articles suggest started under unusual circumstances in a funeral home. I found a photograph from 1923 showing a group called the Liminal Society at a conference in New York. Though the image is grainy, one of the men bears a striking resemblance to Jenkins as described in Thomas Blackwood's account. The society's stated purpose was the study of transitional states and boundaries, ostensibly a philosophical organization. More recently, I discovered an obituary from 1975 for a Professor Harold J. Remus, described as an expert in esoteric photography and optical anomalies. The article mentioned his extensive collection of unexplained photographic phenomena, which was donated to a private research foundation called the Threshold Institute. The Threshold Institute still exists, with offices in Boston, London, and Cairo. Their website describes them as an international organization dedicated to the preservation and study of historical artifacts and documents relating to liminal experience and perception. Their logo, a spiral similar to the amulet Jenkins supposedly wore, cannot be coincidence. I've reached out to them regarding my discovery in Ravenwood, but have yet to receive a response. In the meantime, I've been looking into the funeral I mentioned, that of Morton Greaves, who served as my hometown's mortician for over 40 years. Greaves died in his sleep, apparently of natural causes. Nothing unusual there for a man of 78. But at his funeral, a mourner named Rebecca Chen took a series of photographs with her smartphone. In one of these images, shared on social media as a tribute, there appears to be a figure standing in the doorway of the funeral home chapel, a figure bearing a striking resemblance to Greaves himself. Most who've seen the photo dismiss it as a double exposure or a quirk of light and shadow, but I know better. I've examined the image carefully, comparing it to the 1810 photograph from Ravenwood. The similarities are undeniable, the same translucent quality, the same positioning behind the officiating clergy, the same strange distortion around the edges of the figure. I tried to contact Rebecca Chen to obtain the original image file, hoping to examine it more carefully for signs of manipulation. But according to her roommate, Rebecca hasn't been seen in 3 days. She left for a late-night grocery run and never returned. Her car was found in the store's parking lot, keys still in the ignition. And here's the detail that truly chills me. The responding officer reported finding a small puddle of an unidentified black substance on the driver's seat. 3 other people connected to Greaves' funeral have also disappeared in the past week. A pallbearer, the funeral home assistant who prepared the body, and the florist who provided the arrangements. Local police are treating the cases as unrelated, pointing to the fact that one had gambling debts, another was going through a divorce, and the third had recently received a disturbing medical diagnosis. All plausible reasons for someone to leave town unexpectedly. But I know the pattern now. I've read Jenkins's journal. I've seen the photograph. A breach is opening in my hometown, and I may be the only one who understands what's happening. Last night I drove past Greaves' funeral home after dark. I wasn't planning to enter, I'm not that foolish, but I wanted to see if there were any obvious signs of unusual activity. What I saw made me nearly crash my car. Every window of the Victorian building blazed with light, though the business has been closed since Greaves' death. And silhouetted against one of the upper windows was a figure I recognized immediately as Morton Greaves himself, his distinctive stooped posture unmistakable. As I watched, he turned slowly toward the window, though I was too far away to make out his face. He raised one hand, palm outward, as if in greeting or warning. I drove home at twice the speed limit, checking my rearview mirror constantly. Once safely inside my apartment, doors locked and curtains drawn, I sent an urgent email to the Threshold Institute, detailing everything I'd seen and including scans of the journal and photograph. This morning, I received a response. Brief but clear. Stay where you are. A representative will contact you within 24 hours. Take no further action. Avoid the funeral home and anyone connected to Greaves. Trust no one who acts out of character, even slightly. It was signed simply H.J. Harold Jenkins. Impossible, of course. The man would be over 250 years old. But perhaps the initials are a code, a way for society members to identify themselves to those who know what to look for. So now I wait. The sunlight is fading, and I've checked every lock 3 times. I've lined my doorway and windowsills with salt, a precaution that feels absurd in the 21st century, but one I'm not willing to forgo given what I know. The old photograph in my hand seems heavier somehow, as if weighted with the knowledge it contains. In it, Ezekiel Hargrove stands behind the priest, his eyes fixed on a point beyond the camera, perhaps looking at Harold Jenkins, perhaps looking through time itself to where I sit now, reading his story, holding the evidence of impossibility. I carefully place the photograph back inside the journal and lock it in my desk drawer. Tomorrow I may meet someone from Jenkins's society. Tonight I'll double-check the locks on my doors and windows, draw the curtains tight, and try not to think about what faces might be pressing against the glass, wearing the features of people I once knew, waiting for an invitation to enter. And I'll try not to notice the small puddle of black liquid that has appeared beneath my study door, seeping inward from the hallway beyond, glistening in the lamplight like an oil spill made of midnight. Because some stories don't end when you close the book. Some stories are just beginning. As I sit here, recording these findings, I realize that by uncovering this photograph, by reading Jenkins's journal, I may have inadvertently drawn attention to myself. The entities beyond the breach, according to Jenkins, are aware of those who become aware of them. It's a dangerous knowledge to possess, but it's too late to turn back now. The photograph exists. The breach in Ravenwood was sealed, but others have opened since, and will open again. The pattern continues, playing out across decades and centuries, so I leave this record alongside the photograph and journal for whoever comes searching after me. If you're reading this and I am nowhere to be found, or worse, if you find someone wearing my face but acting strange, asking odd questions, leaving black residue in their wake, know that the breach is real, the danger is real. And the things that stand behind priests at funerals where they don't belong, they're real too. They're coming through, wearing familiar faces, learning to pass as human, and they're hungry. Look closely at the photographs in your family albums. Study the faces in the background of your snapshots. Pay attention to subtle wrongness, eyes that don't quite focus, expressions that don't quite fit, shadows that fall in impossible directions. Because Ezekiel Hargrove wasn't the first to stand behind his own funeral service, and he won't be the last. The photograph is growing colder in my hands. I should put it away now. I should stop looking at Ezekiel's face, stop noticing how his eyes seem to have shifted slightly since I first found the image, how they now appear to be looking directly at me. I should definitely stop wondering why the black puddle beneath my door seems to be expanding, creeping across the floorboards toward my desk with purpose. I should stop, but I can't, because I need to know what Ezekiel saw, what Jenkins knew, what waits on the other side of the breach. Don't we all want to know what happens after we die? Ezekiel found out, and he came back to tell us. All we have to do is listen. The photograph whispers in my hands. The temperature in my study drops suddenly, my breath fogging in front of me. The black liquid has reached the leg of my chair, and somewhere, in a town I've never visited, someone is preparing a body for burial, unwittingly creating another anchor point, another thin place, another breach waiting to open. The cycle continues. The dead return, and they're standing right behind you.